All right, in this episode of our Introduction to Apologetics series, we're going to conclude our review of the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. By way of reminder, the historical case for the resurrection that we are summarizing here unfolds in two steps. The first step is to establish the strongly attested facts that will serve as the historical evidence. In the last two episodes, we've been focused on this step in the argument as we've presented and reviewed 6 well-attested historical facts from which the resurrection of Jesus may be inferred. The second step in the argument is to show that the resurrection of Jesus is the best or the most probable explanation for the facts over and against rival hypotheses. In this episode, we will focus our attention on this second step in the argument by critically reviewing the most prominent and promising of those hypotheses that have been offered as alternative explanations of the well-established historical evidence. Historians and scholars who deny the resurrection of Jesus must come up with a convincing alternative explanation for the well-attested historical evidence that we've reviewed. And down through the centuries, there have been a number of attempts to do this. Now, in one sense, offering an alternative explanation for the historical evidence of the resurrection is quite easy. Simply tell a consistent story that accounts for all the facts. Perhaps Jesus had a twin that nobody knew about. Perhaps Jesus was an alien with sophisticated technology to create powerful illusions to fool a bunch of first-century Jews. Perhaps we're living in a computer simulation created by a super advanced artificial intelligence, and the events surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus, like all events from history, never actually happened. But we all know that if we're going to give a rational explanation for something, we can't merely tell a consistent story. We also have to provide reasons for thinking that the story that we're telling is likely to be true. In other words, we need evidence. Moreover, if the explanation is to be preferred over that of the resurrection, it must be shown that it accounts for the evidence better than does the resurrection of Jesus. So here, I'm not interested in evaluating every ridiculous story that people have come up with to account for the facts, but only those serious alternative hypotheses that have been offered by and have enjoyed at least some prominence among the relevant scholars and historians. In other words, we're going to focus here on the best of the alternative theories that have been proposed to account for the facts by those who reject the resurrection of Jesus. And when it comes to evaluating alternative historical hypotheses, recall that historians weigh the relative strength of various theories or explanations by measuring them against several key factors, such as explanatory power, which measures how well a historical theory explains or accounts for the available facts; explanatory scope, which measures how many of the available facts are explained or accounted for by a historical theory; plausibility, which measures how reasonable a historical theory is; and degree of ad hocness, which measures how contrived a historical theory is. When considering a rival explanation to the resurrection of Jesus, we will seek to evaluate it against these key factors. And in doing so, we want to know two things. First, how well the hypothesis in question measures up against these factors. And second, how well it measures up against them as compared with the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so let's consider some of the more prominent alternative theories that have been offered to account for the evidence of the resurrection. The first and oldest explanation offered by the critics of the resurrection goes by the name of the conspiracy or fraud theory. This is the theory that the disciples stole the body of Jesus from the tomb and lied about experiences of seeing the risen Jesus afterward. According to this explanation, the resurrection was a hoax foisted upon the world by those who were followers of Jesus prior to his crucifixion. As I say, this is the first and oldest explanation given by the enemies of Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that the Jewish leaders were spreading the story that the disciples of Jesus stole his body from the tomb. In his dialogue with Trypho, written about AD 150, Justin Martyr tells us that the religious leaders of the Jews were still spreading this same story over a century later. How does the conspiracy or fraud theory measure up? It does seem to explain some of our well-attested historical facts, such as the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the alleged origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. But there are many severe problems with the idea that the disciples committed what would have been the greatest fraud in the history of the world. First, the theory has only limited explanatory scope because it doesn't account for all of the facts that need to be explained. It certainly doesn't account for the conversion of Paul. As an enemy of the early Jesus movement and member of the Jewish religious authority, Paul would have suspected fraud from the very beginning and so would not have been deceived. Remember that Paul himself was not convinced by the preaching of the disciples. He was convinced by an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. Likewise, the theory doesn't account for the conversion of James. As we've seen, James was not a believer of Jesus while Jesus was alive, and there is no reason to think that he would have been susceptible to the disciples' lies. Like Paul, James too was probably not convinced by the disciples, but by a separate appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And although at first blush, the conspiracy or fraud theory may seem to account for the empty tomb, the fact that the Jewish leaders initially intended to explain away, upon further reflection, it seems to fail even here. For if the disciples stole the corpse of Jesus with the intent to deceive people into thinking that Jesus rose from the grave, why would they fabricate a story in which women were the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb? Recall that in first century Palestine, the testimony of women was considered second-rate at best. So if making up the story, why not have a man discover the empty tomb? Why not Peter or John or even Joseph of Arimathea? Moreover, the conspiracy or fraud theory is severely lacking in explanatory power because it must assume that the disciples were insincere in their belief concerning the resurrection of Jesus. But as we've seen in a previous episode, there's simply no doubt that the disciples really believed what they were reporting, since they were willing to suffer and die, and we know that several of them did suffer and die for the claim that they had seen the risen Jesus alive from the dead. Again, although some people may be willing to die for what they believe to be true, nobody dies for what he knows to be a lie. Liars make poor martyrs. The theory is also seriously lacking in plausibility, since it can't explain what would have motivated the disciples to commit such a hoax in the first place. Recall that when we considered the fact of the origin of the Christian faith in a previous episode, we said that the existing beliefs concerning the resurrection and the Messiah among first century Palestinian Jews was markedly different and at odds with the resurrection of Jesus in multiple respects. There simply would not have been any antecedent motivation or context for the disciples to hoax a resurrection. William Lane Craig explains the anachronism involved here when he writes, quote, "The conspiracy hypothesis views the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, rather than through the eyes of a first-century Jew. There was no expectation of a Messiah who, instead of establishing David's throne and subduing Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by the Gentiles as a criminal. Moreover, the idea of an eschatological resurrection was unconnected with the idea of Messiah and even incompatible with it. The idea of stealing Jesus' corpse and saying that God had raised him from the dead is hardly one that would have entered the minds of the disciples." End quote. Finally, as with all conspiracy theories in general, the conspiracy or fraud theory has a high degree of ad hocness. It has to maintain that the evidence that seems to strongly point to the resurrection can be explained away by a hypothesis that has no actual evidence of its own in its favor. There is simply no evidence whatsoever in support of the idea that the disciples were in a state of mind or had any motivation to pull off such a hoax, or that they did in fact pull it off. For these reasons and more, the conspiracy or fraud theory has not been popular among scholars, with only a handful defending it over the last couple of centuries, and with virtually no scholarly defenders today. So there's been virtually no scholarly support for the idea that the disciples were deceivers. But perhaps they weren't deceivers, but rather deceived. Perhaps they were sincere in what they were claiming, but also sincerely deluded. We turn now to hypotheses that try to account for the facts by assuming that the disciples were sincerely duped or mistaken. One such hypothesis is the apparent death, also called the Swoon theory. This theory was put forward by a handful of critics in the early 19th century who suggested that Jesus was not actually dead when removed from the cross and entombed, but that he was close enough to death to appear that way to those who interacted with his body. And after being entombed, Jesus revived. He then exited the tomb, and he made his way to his disciples where he convinced them that he had risen from the dead. How does the apparent death theory measure up as an explanation for the evidence? Well, like the conspiracy or fraud theory, it does offer a possible explanation for some of the evidence, including the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the appearance to James, and the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. But the apparent death theory has some fatal problems. The most obvious problem is that of plausibility. There is virtually zero chance that Jesus would have survived the crucifixion. The process was brutal and designed to end in agonizing and certain death. Before being crucified, Jesus was scourged, a process that by itself would have brought him to the brink of death. Jesus was then fastened to the cross with nails driven into his hands or wrists and feet or ankles. Although blood loss and trauma were enough to kill crucifixion victims, ultimately, they would probably die of asphyxiation first. In order to exhale, Jesus would have had to continuously lift himself up, bearing the weight of his body on the nails in his feet or ankles. In addition to causing agonizing pain, the process would have taken significant physical effort. Eventually, a crucifixion victim would become too exhausted to lift himself to exhale and would suffocate in the downward position. Crucifixion victims could hang on the cross for days before dying. However, when the Roman executioners wanted to speed up the process, they would employ what was called the crurifragium, or the breaking of the legs of the crucified victim, which would prevent them from exhaling and causing immediate suffocation. Now, it was easy to tell when a crucified victim was dead because the lifting motion necessary to breathe would cease. The Gospel of John tells us that the Jews had requested that the Roman soldiers perform the crurifragium on Jesus and the other crucified victims so that his body would not remain on the cross during Passover. But when the soldiers approached Jesus to break his legs, they refrained because it was obvious that he was already dead. Instead, one of them stabbed the side of Jesus with a spear to confirm death, which caused blood and water to flow, probably due to the rupturing of the pericardium, or the sac that surrounds the heart. So the idea that Jesus was still alive when taken down from the cross, a fact, by the way, that would have had to be missed by both the professional Roman executioners as well as those who prepped Jesus' body for burial. Well, this just strains credulity. The apparent death theory also fails to have adequate explanatory power. It fails to explain, for example, how a severely battered and beaten Jesus could have managed to move the stone that would have sealed his tomb. It also fails to adequately explain the post-mortem appearances to the disciples, as well as the origin of the Christian faith. A half-dead Jesus, in desperate need of medical care, would not have convinced his disciples that he had, in fact, gloriously risen from the grave, that he had conquered death. Moreover, given the prevailing Jewish thought of the time, upon seeing the half-dead Jesus, the disciples would not have been predisposed to conclude, against Jewish teaching, that Jesus had gloriously risen from the dead. Rather, they would have been predisposed to believe that Jesus had not actually died at all, that he had somehow barely survived the crucifixion. The apparent death theory also provides no explanation for the transformative conversion of the Apostle Paul. Paul claimed to have been changed after his own glorious appearance of the risen Jesus, hardly a description appropriate to a half-dead, battered Jesus. So because of these insuperable and fatal flaws, the apparent death theory has been almost totally abandoned by scholars and historians who study the subject today. Okay, so Jesus definitely died as a result of the crucifixion, and he stayed dead. But maybe some of the female followers who went to visit his grave after his crucifixion, maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Instead of going to the actual tomb of Jesus that held his body, maybe they went to a different tomb, one that was empty. And upon seeing the vacant tomb, the women then fled and reporting the finding to the disciples of Jesus, who then experienced visions of Jesus alive. This is the basic idea behind the wrong tomb theory, first proposed in the early 20th century, which postulates that belief in Jesus' resurrection was a result of a simple mistake. The wrong tomb theory is seriously deficient as an explanation for the well-attested historical facts. It has narrow explanatory scope. The only fact that it really explains is the empty tomb itself. It doesn't do anything to explain the post-mortem appearances. To explain these, we'd need another auxiliary theory as to why and how the disciples came to have such experiences. It doesn't do anything to explain the origin of the Christian faith. Merely witnessing the vacant tomb, assumed to be that of Jesus, would not have led a first-century Palestinian Jew to conclude that Jesus had risen from the dead. It doesn't do anything to explain the conversions of the enemy Paul or the skeptic James, neither of whom would have been convinced by the mere fact of an empty tomb. It also clearly lacks explanatory power, since the followers of Jesus, including Paul and James, were not convinced that Jesus had risen from the grave because his tomb was found empty, but rather because the risen Jesus had appeared to them. In fact, according to the gospel accounts, the empty tomb convinced no one except for John. In the Gospels, we're told that Mary initially thought that the gardener had stolen the body of Jesus, and that the disciples, upon seeing the empty tomb, became confused. It was the appearances, and not the empty tomb, that convinced the disciples of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. The wrong tomb theory also lacks plausibility, because it is in direct conflict with the fact that the location of the tomb of Jesus was known. As we noted when we looked at the well-attested fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty by a group of his women followers, there is good evidence that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, himself a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, and that the location of the tomb was known by both Jesus' enemies and his followers alike. So if the women went to the wrong tomb on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion and mistakenly concluded that Jesus had risen, well, this was an error that could have been easily remedied by the disciples or by the Jewish leaders with a visit to the actual tomb of Jesus to verify that his body was still there. So for these reasons, the wrong tomb theory was dead on arrival, as it failed to elicit any support when it was first offered and has virtually no following among historians and scholars who study the subject today. And other alternative explanations that seek to account for the empty tomb, such as the theory that Joseph of Arimathea moved the body of Jesus prior to the arrival of the women followers on Sunday morning, or the so-called misplaced body theory, they face the same problems as the wrong tomb theory, and they fare no better among the relevant scholars and historians who specialize in the subject. As our response to the wrong tomb theory makes clear, the real heart of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is the post-mortem appearances of the risen Jesus to the disciples and to Paul and to James. It is the appearances of the risen Jesus in particular that grounded their sincere belief in the resurrection. Not surprisingly, then, critics have aimed specifically at explaining away these alleged visitations of the risen Jesus, and they've done so primarily by appeal to natural psychological phenomenon. The most popular theory that appeals to such psychological phenomenon is the hallucination theory. The hallucination theory postulates that what the disciples actually experienced after the crucifixion were not visitations of the risen Jesus, but hallucinations of the risen Jesus. Critics often cite the well-documented and fairly common psychological phenomenon of grief hallucinations, wherein a person perceives a loved one who has recently died. According to this theory, after the death of their leader, the disciples would have been in a state of profound grief, a state which made them susceptible to a psychological projection of Jesus alive from the dead. Now, on the face of it, the hallucination theory seems to be a natural way to account for the central fact of the post-mortem appearances to the disciples and for the sincerity of the disciples' belief, not to mention the origin of the Christian faith. However, on closer examination, the theory begins to fall apart. For one thing, it has quite a limited explanatory scope, as it leaves out several of our well-attested facts unaccounted for. It doesn't explain the fact that the tomb of Jesus was found empty by his women followers. It doesn't really explain the conversion of Paul, the persecutor, even if grief hallucinations could account for the experiences of the disciples. It can't be used to account for the appearance to Paul, since Paul was not in mourning over the death of Jesus, and therefore he would not have been in the proper state of mind to experience such a phenomenon. It also doesn't explain the conversion of James the skeptic. Although we don't know the state of mind that James was in after the crucifixion, as we do with Paul, there is simply nothing to suggest that he was deeply grief-stricken over his brother's death. Moreover, it seems unlikely that a pious Jewish believer who would have viewed his crucified brother as a false Messiah who had been cursed by God, it's unlikely that such a person would be in the frame of mind to experience a life-changing hallucination of the risen Jesus that would motivate him to alter his deeply held religious beliefs. And to the degree that the hallucination theory attempts to explain these other facts, it becomes increasingly ad hoc, for it must posit some other theory to explain the empty tomb, and it must rely on a dubious psychoanalysis of both Paul and James to get them into the right frame of mind so that they would project their own independent hallucinatory experiences. Moreover, the hallucination theory lacks explanatory power. Even those facts that the theory is specifically designed to account for are left unexplained by this theory. The hallucination theory fails to adequately account for the origin of the Christian faith as depending on the belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Even if the disciples, in their state of grief, experienced hallucinations of Jesus, there is no reason to think that they would have projected Jesus as being resurrected from the dead. Their Jewish beliefs would have prevented them from doing so. Craig is again insightful here. He writes, quote, "Hallucinations as projections of the mind can contain nothing new. Therefore, given the current Jewish beliefs about life after death, the disciples, were they to project hallucinations of Jesus, would have seen Jesus in heaven or in Abraham's bosom, where the souls of the righteous dead were believed to abide until the resurrection. And such visions would not have caused belief in Jesus' resurrection. At the most, it would have only led the disciples to say that Jesus had been translated or assumed into heaven, not raised from the dead. For the Jew, a translation is not the same as a resurrection. Translation is the bodily assumption of someone out of this world into heaven. Resurrection is the raising up of a dead man in the space-time universe. They are distinct categories." End quote. The hallucination theory also fails to account for the post-mortem appearances of the risen Jesus. It is well known that hallucinations are private events which occur in the mind of the individual. And in this way, they're similar to dreams. They're not collective or group experiences. They can't be shared between individuals. Even if you had a group of people who were ripe for grief hallucinations, each would project and perceive a private image. They would not share in the same experience. But as we saw when we examined the well-attested fact of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, several of the appearances were to groups of people. And this is a fact that weighs heavily against the hallucination hypothesis. The appearances of Jesus also varied greatly in their circumstances, which also further compounds the problems with the hallucination theory. Craig writes, quote, "The diversity of appearances bursts the bounds of anything found in the psychological case books. Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times, not at just one locale and circumstance, but at a variety of places and circumstances, not to just one individual, but to different persons, not to just individuals, but to various groups, not to just believers, but to unbelievers and even enemies. Those who would explain the resurrection appearances psychologically are compelled to construct a composite picture by cobbling together different unrelated cases of hallucinatory experiences, which only serves to underline the fact that there is nothing like the resurrection appearances in the psychological casebooks." end quote. So given what we know about the nature of hallucinatory phenomenon, the hallucination theory is also highly implausible as an explanation for all the incident variances of the post-mortem appearances. Although the hallucination theory enjoyed some popularity at the turn of the 20th century, it has few adherents today, though admittedly more adherents than any of the other theories that we looked at so far. There are simply too many serious flaws in the theory to make it a live alternative to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, you may be thinking, perhaps none of these theories on their own provide an adequate alternative explanation for the well-attested evidence for the resurrection. But what if we combine some of them together? In this way, we can fill in the explanatory gaps left by one theory by adding another theory. So, for example, we could appeal to the wrong tomb theory to account for the empty tomb, to the hallucination theory to account for the appearances to the disciples and to the origin of the Christian faith, and then some kind of other psychological explanation to account for the conversion of Paul and James. But this approach simply will not do. For one thing, combination theories are ad hoc, since they are contrived to fit the evidence in an artificial way. Critics who deploy multiple theories for which there is no evidence to explain the well-attested evidence for the resurrection seem to be more interested in explaining the evidence away rather than in knowing what really happened. For another thing, when it comes to arguments to the best explanation or abductive reasoning, theories that are simpler, all things considered, should be preferred over those that are more complex. And this for a simple reason. Theories that are more complex have more ways that they can go wrong and are therefore, again, all things considered, less likely to be true. Combining theories together then actually decreases the probability of truth, since for the combination theory to be true, all the parts or all the sub-theories have to be true. And finally, merely combining theories together to account for all the facts does nothing at all to address the inadequacies of the individual theories themselves. All of the problems with explanatory power, plausibility, and ad hocness will carry over in the combination theory. Critics who deny the resurrection of Jesus have been offering alternative naturalistic theories for a couple thousand years now. There is really nothing new under the sun here. Historians and scholars who study the subject, well, they know that there is simply no theory that can adequately and sufficiently account for all the well-attested facts that make up the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Of course, that's not the end of the story. Many critics, nevertheless, still reject the resurrection of Jesus as an explanation as well. And the prevalent attitude among scholars and historians who deny the resurrection of Jesus today is to admit that something happened, but exactly what happened will never be known. But the problem with this common skeptical attitude is that it's a simple dismissal of the evidence that we do have for the resurrection of Jesus. Merely rejecting the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead is not the same as rejecting the evidence for that conclusion. The evidence is still there, and it still demands an explanation. Now, in response, some critics will maintain that skepticism is warranted because no theory adequately explains the evidence, including the resurrection theory. The failure, we're told, of naturalistic theories to account for the evidence does not entail the success of the resurrection theory. Maybe all our theories are bad, and we should therefore keep looking for a better one. But this, too, is a poor response, because the resurrection of Jesus doesn't succeed simply because all the other naturalistic theories fail. Rather, the resurrection of Jesus succeeds precisely because it is a good explanation when assessed against and measured by the standard criteria for the justification of historical hypotheses. In other words, the resurrection succeeds as an explanation precisely where the naturalistic theories fail. The resurrection of Jesus has explanatory power. It adequately explains the historical data. It sufficiently accounts for the well-attested facts. The resurrection of Jesus has wide explanatory scope. It doesn't just adequately account for the facts. It adequately accounts for all of the well-attested facts. And the resurrection of Jesus is not at all ad hoc. It doesn't require auxiliary hypotheses. It doesn't require contrived scenarios and circumstances for which there is no evidence. Nor does it rely on dubious historical psychoanalysis on the disciples, on Paul and on James, to explain the facts. But what about plausibility? Don't we run into a problem here? How plausible is it to suppose that Jesus rose from the dead? Isn't the fact that dead people stay dead as strong as any fact can be? And doesn't this mean that no matter how good the historical evidence, the resurrection hypothesis should nevertheless be rejected because it posits the highly improbable idea that a man rose from the dead? Well, several things can be said in response to this. First, we have to keep in mind that there was a historical context to the resurrection of Jesus, apart from which it cannot be properly evaluated. Jesus wasn't just some random regular guy who died and then spontaneously rose from the grave. While he was alive, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God in a special and unique way, a fact that is well attested historically. And Jesus didn't just make this claim, he did things to back it up. That Jesus was known to be a powerful miracle worker is also well attested historically. And as the gospel accounts tell us, Jesus also predicted that he was going to be murdered and that he was going to rise from the dead, a prediction that baffled the disciples who had no context in their Jewish minds for a resurrected Messiah. So the resurrection of Jesus can't be separated from the religious and historical context of his unique life and ministry. And second, and crucially, the resurrection does not amount to the claim that Jesus rose naturally and spontaneously from the dead. This would indeed be highly implausible. Rather, the claim of the resurrection is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And whether this latter claim is implausible will, of course, depend on whether God's existence itself is implausible. So the plausibility of the resurrection is firmly linked to the plausibility of God's existence. And this is the very reason why in this introduction to Apologetics series, we've considered the resurrection of Jesus only after looking at some reasons for thinking that God exists. And as we've seen over the course of this series, there are good reasons, very good reasons, to think that God does, in fact, exist. And at the very least, we have seen that there are good reasons to think that the existence of God is not at all implausible. If God exists, well, then miracles are possible. And if miracles are possible, then there is no reason to think it implausible that God would raise Jesus from the dead, that he would raise this very Jesus who said the things that he said and did the things that he did, this Jesus who has transformed the world over and who is still transforming lives today.